The wind screamed through the canyon like 1,000 angry ghosts, and Josephine Vance knew she was going to die in this God-forsaken blizzard unless something changed fast. 6 men on horseback circled her wagon with weapons drawn, their faces wrapped in filthy bandanas, eyes glinting with intentions far worse than robbery. She clutched the rifle her father had given her before he died, but her hands trembled so violently from cold and fear that she could barely keep her finger on the trigger. The storm had rolled down from the mountains without warning, swallowing the Arizona high country in a white fury that turned February of 1882 into a frozen hell. These men had appeared out of the snow like demons, surrounding her before she even knew they were there. "Just hand over whatever you got, girl, and maybe we'll let you live," the leader shouted over the howling wind. His voice was rough as gravel, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath even from several feet away. Josephine raised her rifle, knowing it was futile but refusing to give up without a fight. "You'll have to kill me first," she called back, her voice stronger than she felt. The men laughed, a cruel sound that cut through the storm. One of them dismounted, taking a step toward her wagon. That was when the first shot rang out. The sound cracked through the air like thunder, and the man who had been approaching her dropped into the snow, a red stain blooming across his chest. The bandits wheeled their horses around, searching for the source of the gunfire, confusion and panic replacing their earlier confidence. 2 more shots followed in rapid succession, each one finding its mark with deadly precision. Another man fell from his saddle, and a third clutched his shoulder, screaming. The remaining 3 bandits fired wildly into the white void, but they were shooting at shadows. A 4th shot rang out, and the leader who had threatened Josephine tumbled backward off his horse, dead before he hit the frozen ground. "Ride out or die here," a voice commanded from somewhere in the swirling snow. It was deep and steady, carrying an authority that came from a man who had faced death before and was not impressed by it. The 2 uninjured men did not need to be told twice. They spurred their horses and vanished into the blizzard, leaving their wounded companion behind. The injured man tried to follow, but his horse bolted, and he stumbled through the snow on foot, disappearing into the white curtain. Josephine stood frozen in her wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs, unsure if her rescuer was friend or another kind of threat. A figure emerged from the storm, leading a massive bay horse behind him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat dusted with snow. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low over his eyes, and a rifle was slung across his back. As he came closer, she could see his face was weathered and strong, with a dark beard covering his jaw and eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most, and there was something both dangerous and gentle in the way he moved. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler now than when he had been threatening the bandits. "No," Josephine managed, lowering her rifle slightly. "But I would have been if you had not come along. Thank you," he nodded, glancing at the bodies in the snow. "We need to get out of this storm before we freeze to death. There is a line shack about 2 miles east of here. Can your wagon make it?" "I think so," she said, though truthfully she was not sure of anything anymore. The cold had seeped into her bones, and her fingers were numb inside her gloves. "Follow close behind me," he said, mounting his horse in one fluid motion. "Do not lose sight of me, or you will die out here." Josephine snapped the reins, urging her horses forward. The wagon lurched through the deep snow, and she kept her eyes fixed on the broad back of the stranger who had saved her life. The wind tore at her clothes and face, and the cold was so intense it felt like knives cutting into her skin. She had been traveling from Tucson to Agua Caliente to take up a teaching position at the small schoolhouse there, but the storm had caught her in the high country between the towns. She had thought she was prepared for the journey, but nothing could have prepared her for this. Time lost all meaning in the white chaos. It could have been 20 minutes or 2 hours before she saw the dark shape of a small cabin emerging from the snow. Her rescuer dismounted and pushed open the door, then came back to help her down from the wagon. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground, and he caught her with strong hands. "Easy now," he said. "Let us get you inside." The cabin was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had a small stove and a stack of firewood that looked like treasure. He guided her to a chair and immediately set about building a fire. Within minutes, flames were crackling in the stove, and blessed warmth began to fill the tiny space. Josephine watched him work, studying his profile in the firelight. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent his entire life in harsh conditions, wasting no motion or energy. "What is your name?" she asked when the silence stretched too long. He glanced at her, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. "Graham Brennan," he finally said. "Most folks just call me Brennan. I am Josephine Vance. Everyone calls me Josie. What is a woman doing traveling alone in this country, especially with a storm coming?" There was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity. "I did not know the storm was coming," she said defensively. "The sky was clear when I left Tucson 3 days ago. I am going to Agua Caliente to be a schoolteacher," he nodded, pulling off his gloves and holding his hands toward the fire. "Agua Caliente is a hard town. Not much there but ranchers and miners. You sure that is where you want to be?" "I do not have much choice," Josie said quietly. "My father died 6 months ago. He left debts I cannot pay and I need work. The school board there offered me a position and I took it." Graham looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. His eyes were gray like she had thought, but up close she could see flecks of blue in them, like ice on a winter river. There was intelligence there and something that looked like old pain. "I am sorry about your father," he said. "That is a hard thing to carry." "What about you?" she asked. "What brings you out into this storm?" "I work for the Double B Ranch, about 15 miles south of here. We had cattle scattered in the storm, and I was trying to round them up when I heard the gunshots." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Those men who had you surrounded, they are part of the Dalton gang. They have been terrorizing this territory for months. The law cannot seem to catch them." "You killed 3 of them," Josie said, and despite everything she felt a shiver that was not from cold. She had never seen anyone die before today, and now she had watched 3 men fall in the space of minutes. Graham's expression darkened. "They would have killed you, or worse." "I do not lose sleep over men like that." The storm raged outside, shaking the walls of the little cabin. Graham tended to the horses, bringing them into a lean-to shelter attached to the back of the shack, where they would be protected from the worst of the wind. He came back inside covered in fresh snow, and Josie realized with a start that they were going to be trapped here together until the blizzard passed. The thought should have frightened her, alone with a strange man in the middle of nowhere, but instead she felt oddly safe. "How long do you think the storm will last?" she asked as he shook the snow from his coat. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. We have enough wood to keep warm, and I have some jerky and hardtack in my saddlebags. We will not starve." "Days." The word hung between them, heavy with implications. Josie thought about her reputation, about what people would say when they learned she had been alone with a man for days. But then she thought about those bandits, about the way Graham had not hesitated to save her, and she decided that living with a damaged reputation was better than not living at all. "Thank you again," she said softly. For saving my life. I know I already said it, but I truly mean it. You did not have to help me. Yes, I did, Graham said, and there was a fierceness in his voice that surprised her. No decent man could ride away from something like that. They fell into an uneasy silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind. As the cabin warmed, Josie began to feel the exhaustion of the day settling into her bones. Her eyes kept drifting closed and she would jerk awake, trying to stay alert. Get some rest, Graham said, gesturing to the narrow cot in the corner. I will keep the fire going and keep watch. I cannot take the only bed, Josie protested. I have slept on worse than a wooden floor, he said with a slight smile that transformed his stern face into something almost handsome. Please, you are safe here. The simple kindness in those words broke something loose inside her, and to her horror, Josie felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had been so scared, so alone, and now this stranger was offering her safety and comfort without asking for anything in return. She turned away quickly, not wanting him to see her cry, but he must have noticed because he said quietly, "It is all right to be scared. You have been through something terrible today." "I am not usually like this," she said, wiping at her eyes. "I am not some weak woman who falls apart at the first sign of trouble." "I did not think you were," Graham said. "You were holding a rifle on 6 armed men when I found you. That takes more courage than most people have." His words steadied her, and she managed a shaky smile. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. He said a woman alone needed to know how to protect herself." "Your father was a wise man." Josie lay down on the cot, pulling the thin blanket over herself. She expected to lie awake all night, her mind replaying the attack over and over, but the warmth and the exhaustion caught up with her. She fell asleep watching Graham's silhouette against the firelight, feeling safer than she had any right to feel. She woke to the smell of coffee and the gray light of morning filtering through the cabin's single window. The storm was still raging outside, but with less fury than the night before. Graham was crouched by the fire, heating a tin pot of water. He looked up when he heard her stir. "Morning," he said. "Coffee will be ready in a minute. It is not much, but it is hot." Josie sat up, running a hand through her disheveled hair. She must look a sight, but Graham's expression held nothing but polite concern. "How long was I asleep?" "Most of the night." "It is near dawn now, though you would not know it with this storm." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and she felt a jolt of something electric pass between them. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "A little. I am used to keeping odd hours." He settled onto the floor across from her, his long legs stretched out toward the fire. "Storm should break by afternoon if we are lucky, then we can get you to Agua Caliente." "What about the bodies?" Josie asked quietly. "The men you killed. Should we not do something about them?" Graham's expression hardened. "When we get to town, I will report to the sheriff. He will send someone out to collect them once the storm clears. Those men made their choices, and they died because of those choices. That is the way of things out here." There was a finality in his voice that told her he had done this before, had killed before. Josie should have been frightened by that, but instead she found herself wondering what kind of life had made him so comfortable with violence. He did not seem like a bad man, but he was clearly a hard one, shaped by hard circumstances. "How long have you been in Arizona?" she asked, wanting to understand him better. 5 years, give or take. I came out from Kansas after the war. You fought in the war." She did quick math in her head. If he was around 30 now, he would have been just a boy when the war ended in 1865. "Tail end of it," he said shortly. "I do not talk about that time much. I am sorry. I did not mean to pry." He shook his head. "You are not prying." It is just old history, and I prefer to look forward rather than back." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. "What about you? Where are you from?" "Illinois originally, but my father moved us to Tucson when I was 16. He was a doctor, and he thought the dry air would help his lungs." "It did not," she smiled sadly. "But I fell in love with the territory anyway. It is harsh and beautiful at the same time." "That it is," Graham agreed. "It will kill you if you are not careful, but there is no place quite like it." They talked through the morning as the storm continued to rage outside. Graham told her about the Double B Ranch, about the hard work of keeping cattle alive in the harsh Arizona desert, about the occasional trips into Agua Caliente for supplies. Josie told him about her father, about growing up helping him tend to patients, about her love of books and teaching. She found herself opening up to him in ways she had not opened up to anyone in months, not since her father had died and left her alone in the world. There was something about Graham that made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable, to share the parts of herself she usually kept hidden. He listened with a focus that made her feel like she was the only person in the world, like her words mattered. When she talked about her father's death, he did not offer empty platitudes or try to minimize her grief. He just listened, and somehow that was more comforting than any words could have been. By afternoon, the wind had died down to a steady howl, and the snow had lightened to scattered flurries. Graham stood and looked out the window, assessing the weather with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his life outdoors. "We can make it to Agua Caliente if we leave now," he said. "It will be slow going, but we should get there before dark." Josie felt a strange reluctance to leave the little cabin. Here, with Graham, she had felt safe and understood in a way she had not felt in a long time. But she knew they could not stay forever, and she had responsibilities waiting for her in town. She stood and gathered her few belongings, wrapping herself in her heavy cloak. The journey to Agua Caliente was every bit as difficult as Graham had predicted. The snow was deep, and the wagon struggled through the drifts. Graham rode ahead on his horse, breaking trail for her wagon to follow. Josie kept her eyes on his broad back, using him as an anchor in the still swirling snow. The landscape was transformed by the blizzard, all familiar landmarks buried under white. If not for Graham, she would have been hopelessly lost. It was near sunset when they finally saw the lights of Agua Caliente twinkling through the gloom. The town was small, just a main street with a handful of buildings clustered around it. Graham led her to the boarding house at the edge of town, a weathered two-story structure with smoke rising from its chimney. "Miss Henderson runs the place," Graham said, helping her down from the wagon. "She is a good woman. Tell her I sent you, and she will take care of you." Josie looked up at him, suddenly desperate to keep him from leaving. "Will I see you again?" Something flickered in his gray eyes, an emotion she could not quite name. "The Double B brings supplies into town every couple of weeks. I expect I will be around." "I would like that," she said, and was surprised by how much she meant it. Graham touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that was almost courtly. "Take care of yourself, Josie Vance. Agua Caliente can be a rough place for a woman alone." Then he was mounting his horse and riding away into the gathering darkness, leaving her standing in the snow with her heart doing strange things in her chest. She watched until he disappeared from view, then turned and knocked on the door of the boarding house. Miss Clara Henderson was a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She welcomed Josie inside, clucking over her frozen hands and wind-burned face. "You poor dear, out in that terrible storm. Come in, come in. Let us get you warm and fed." Over a hot meal of stew and fresh bread, Josie told Miss Henderson about the attack and Graham's rescue, though she left out the part about spending the night alone with him in the line shack. Some things were better kept private, at least until she understood what people in this town were like. "Graham Brennan is a good man," Miss Henderson said when Josie mentioned his name. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he is honest and hardworking. The town owes him a debt for running off those Dalton boys. They have been a plague on this territory." "He killed 3 of them," Josie said quietly. Miss Henderson nodded, unsurprised. "He would not be the first good man forced to kill bad ones out here. It is the way of things. You are lucky he came along when he did." Josie settled into life in Agua Caliente over the next few weeks. The school was a one-room building with a dozen students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. They were rough ranch children for the most part, more comfortable with horses and cattle than books, but they were eager to learn once she gained their trust. Teaching them filled her days with purpose, helping to push away the memories of the attack and the storm. But she could not push away thoughts of Graham Brennan. True to his word, he came into town every couple of weeks with supply wagons from the Double B Ranch. Each time he did, he would find a reason to stop by the schoolhouse, usually bringing some small thing that he thought she might need. A better lamp for reading after dark, a stack of books he had gotten from a traveling merchant, a warm shawl for the cold mornings. Each visit was brief, just a few minutes of conversation before he had to get back to his work, but Josie found herself living for those moments. Graham was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, his words mattered. He asked about her students, about her life in town, about whether she was happy. And slowly, carefully, he began to share pieces of himself with her as well. She learned that he had come west after the war because he could not stand to be in Kansas anymore, could not bear the memories of everything he had lost. His parents had died of cholera when he was young, and he had no other family. The ranch life suited him because it was hard work that left little time for thinking about the past. He was saving money, hoping someday to have his own small spread where he could raise horses. Spring came to the high country slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts. By late March, the desert was beginning to bloom with wildflowers, transforming the harsh landscape into something achingly beautiful. One Saturday afternoon, Graham appeared at the boarding house and asked if Josie would like to go riding with him. She agreed without hesitation, ignoring the knowing look Miss Henderson gave her. They rode out into the desert, away from the town and its watching eyes. Graham led her to a canyon where a spring-fed pool reflected the blue sky, surrounded by cottonwood trees just beginning to leaf out. It was a hidden oasis in the harsh landscape, and Josie caught her breath at the beauty of it. "I come here sometimes when I need to think," Graham said, dismounting and helping her down from her horse. "I wanted to share it with you." They sat on a flat rock by the water, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Josie could feel the warmth of him even through her dress, could smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. Her heart was beating too fast, and she knew this moment was important somehow, that something significant was about to happen. "Josie," Graham said, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that she had never heard before. "I need to tell you something, and I do not know quite how to say it." "Just say it plain," she said, her throat tight. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes intense. "I have not stopped thinking about you since that day in the blizzard. I know we have only known each other a few months, and I know I am just a ranch hand with not much to offer, but I cannot keep pretending I feel nothing. You have gotten under my skin, Josephine Vance, and I do not know what to do about it." Joy flooded through her, so intense it was almost painful. "You do not have to do anything except keep feeling that way," she said softly. "Because I feel the same. I have been hoping you would say something, but I was afraid to hope too much." Graham reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle on hers. I am not good at pretty words and I do not have much experience with courting, but I would like to try if you will let me." "I do not need pretty words," Josie said, squeezing his hand. "I just need you to be honest with me, to be yourself. That is enough." He smiled then, a real smile that lit up his whole face, and she realized how handsome he was when he was not guarding his emotions so carefully. "I can do that," he said. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Josie did not want to pull away. She wanted him, with an intensity that surprised her. When his lips touched hers, it was gentle at first, almost tentative. Then she leaned into him, and the kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and sweet at the same time. She had been kissed before, but never like this, never with this sense of rightness, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. Graham rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I have wanted to do that for months," he said. "Why did you wait so long?" she asked, half teasing. "Because I wanted to do it right. I wanted to court you proper, not rush things." He pulled back to look at her. "You deserve that, Josie. You deserve someone who will treat you with respect." "You saved my life," she reminded him. "I think we are past the stage of careful courtship, do not you?" He laughed, a sound she had never heard from him before and instantly wanted to hear again. "Maybe so, but I still want to do this right. Will you let me court you, Josie, officially?" "Yes," she said, and kissed him again to seal the promise. Over the next few months, their courtship became the talk of Agua Caliente. Graham came into town every chance he got, and they were often seen walking together after school let out, talking and laughing like old friends. Miss Henderson chaperoned them when necessary, but she was not strict about it. As she told Josie one evening, Graham Brennan was clearly a man of honor, and besides, they had already spent a night alone together during the blizzard. What more harm could come from a little unchaperoned conversation? Josie fell more in love with him every day. She loved the way he was so gentle with her students when he visited the school, crouching down to their level to answer their questions about ranch life. She loved the way he brought her small gifts, not expensive things but thoughtful ones, like a perfectly smooth river stone or a hawk feather he had found. She loved the way he listened to her with his whole attention, the way he valued her opinions even when they differed from his own. And she loved the way he kissed her, stealing moments of privacy whenever they could find them, each kiss more passionate than the last. There was a fire between them that grew stronger with each passing day, a desire that was becoming harder to ignore. But Graham was determined to wait until they were married, to do things properly, and Josie respected him for that even as her body ached for more. By summer, everyone in town knew they were serious about each other. The school board was pleased because it meant their teacher was likely to stay in Agua Caliente rather than moving on to some bigger town. The ranchers who employed Graham approved because Josie was a respectable woman who would be a good influence on him. Even the local minister, Reverend Thomas, mentioned to Graham that it would be nice to perform a wedding in the little church for once, rather than just funerals and baptisms. In August, 6 months after the blizzard that had brought them together, Graham asked Josie to ride out to the canyon with him again. She agreed, curious about why he seemed more nervous than usual. When they reached the spring, he helped her down from her horse and then did something she did not expect. He dropped to one knee. "Josie Vance," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I am not a rich man and I cannot promise you an easy life. But I can promise that I will love you every day for the rest of my life. I will work hard to provide for you. I will protect you with everything I have, and I will be faithful to you until the day I die. Will you marry me?" He held out a ring, simple gold with a small stone that caught the light. It was not fancy, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, just like the man offering it to her. "Yes," Josie said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, of course I will marry you." Graham slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms. They kissed there by the water, sealing their promise to each other, and Josie felt like her heart might burst from happiness. She had come to Arizona territory alone and afraid, nearly dying in a blizzard. Now she had found love with a man who was everything she had ever wanted, even if she had not known she wanted it until she met him. They were married in September of 1882, in the little church in Agua Caliente with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Miss Henderson cried through the whole ceremony, and even some of the rough ranchers got misty-eyed watching Graham and Josie exchange their vows. Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, and when Graham kissed his bride, a cheer went up from the assembled crowd. The Double B Ranch gave them a small cabin on the edge of the property as a wedding gift, along with a modest salary increase for Graham. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a porch, but it was theirs. Josie continued teaching at the school, riding the 3 miles into town each day while Graham worked with the cattle. In the evenings, they would sit together on their porch and watch the sun set over the desert, talking about their day and making plans for the future. Their wedding night was everything Josie had dreamed it would be and more. Graham was gentle and patient, taking his time to make sure she was comfortable and cared for. The passion that had been building between them for months finally found its release, and Josie understood why people wrote poetry about this, why songs were sung about love and desire. Being with Graham felt like coming home, like finding a part of herself she had not known was missing. The first year of their marriage was not easy. Money was tight, and the work was hard for both of them. The winter of 1882-1883 was harsh, with several more blizzards that reminded them both of how they had met. But they faced every challenge together, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating the good ones. Graham was everything he had promised to be, a faithful and loving husband who worked tirelessly to provide for them. And Josie discovered that she was stronger than she had known, capable of building a life in this harsh country. In the spring of 1883, Josie realized she was pregnant. She told Graham one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the stars come out. He was silent for a long moment, and she began to worry that he was not happy about it. Then he turned to her with tears in his eyes and pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," he said, kissing her forehead. "You have given me everything, Josie. A home, a family, a reason to wake up in the morning. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person." Their son was born in November of 1883, a healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Samuel Thomas Brennan, after Graham's father and Reverend Thomas, who had married them. Graham was besotted with the baby from the first moment, spending every free moment holding him and marveling at his tiny features. Josie took a year off from teaching to care for Samuel, and during that time, she and Graham grew even closer. The cabin that had seemed so small now felt cozy and full of love. They were building something together, a family and a future, and every day felt like a gift. When Samuel was 2, Josie became pregnant again. Their daughter, Margaret Ellen, was born in the spring of 1886. She was a beautiful baby with blonde hair that neither of them could quite account for, until Graham's boss mentioned that his mother had been blonde. The mystery solved, they fell in love with their daughter just as completely as they had with their son. By 1887, Graham had saved enough money to buy a small parcel of land about 5 miles from Agua Caliente. It was not much, Just 20 acres with a creek running through it, but it was theirs. He built a larger house with his own hands, working evenings and weekends while still keeping his job at the Double B. Josie helped when she could, holding boards in place and handing him nails. Baby Margaret strapped to her back in a sling while Samuel played nearby. When the house was finished, they moved in with a sense of triumph. It was not fancy, but it had 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Graham immediately began building corrals and a small barn, working toward his dream of raising horses. The Double B boss, impressed by Graham's dedication and skill, gave him 3 mares as a parting gift when Graham left to work his own land full-time. Those first few years on their own land were the hardest of their marriage. Money was scarce, and they had to be careful with every penny. But they were happy, working side by side to build something that was entirely theirs. Josie started teaching again once Margaret was old enough, conducting lessons from their home for the scattered ranch children in the area. Graham slowly built up his horse herd, gaining a reputation for breeding strong, reliable mounts. By 1890, the Brennan Ranch was starting to turn a real profit. Graham's horses were in demand throughout the territory, and Josie's school had grown to nearly 20 students. They hired a young man to help with the ranch work, giving Graham more time to train horses and spend with his family. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. In the summer of 1890, Josie discovered she was pregnant for a 3rd time. She was 30 years old now, and the pregnancy was harder than the previous 2 had been. Graham worried over her constantly, insisting she rest and take care of herself. Their 3rd child, a boy they named Daniel Patrick, was born in February of 1891 after a difficult labor that left Josie weak for weeks afterward. Graham was terrified of losing her, and he made her promise that this would be their last child. "I love our children more than life itself," he told her, "but I could not survive losing you. Please, Josie, no more." She agreed, both because she was tired and because she could see the genuine fear in his eyes. 3 children were more than enough blessing for one lifetime. They had Samuel, who was now 7 and already showing signs of being a natural horseman like his father. They had Margaret, who was 5 and as smart as a whip, already reading at a level far beyond her years. And now they had Daniel, a peaceful baby who rarely cried and seemed content just to be held. The years passed quickly after that, measured in the milestones of their children's lives. Samuel's first solo ride, Margaret's first day helping her mother teach the younger students, Daniel taking his first steps, Graham's horses winning prizes at the territorial fair, Josie's school being officially recognized by the territorial government. In 1896, when Samuel was 13, he told his parents he wanted to join his father in the horse business full-time. Graham was thrilled, and he began teaching his son everything he knew about breeding and training horses. Margaret, at 11, announced that she wanted to be a teacher like her mother and started helping with lessons every day after finishing her own schoolwork. Daniel, at 5, was still young enough that his future was uncertain, but he showed an interest in everything, asking questions constantly and soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Graham and Josie often sat on their porch in the evenings, just like they had in the early days of their marriage, and marveled at what they had built together. The frightened woman surrounded by bandits in a blizzard, and the lonely cowboy who had saved her, had created a life full of love and purpose. "You ever regret it?" Graham asked her one evening in the summer of 1898. They were watching the sun set, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Marrying me, I mean. You could have had an easier life if you had married someone else, someone with more money or education. Josie lifted her head to look at him, surprised by the question. After 16 years of marriage, she thought he would know better. Graham Brennan, that is the most foolish thing I have ever heard you say. Regret marrying you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You saved my life, and then you gave me a life worth living. How could I possibly regret that? He smiled, that same smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. I love you, Josie. I just wanted to make sure you knew that. I love you too, she said, kissing him softly. Always have, always will. In 1900, as the new century dawned, the Brennan family gathered on their porch to watch the sunset on the last day of December. Samuel was 16 now, nearly a man, working alongside his father every day. Margaret was 14, already helping her mother run the school and talking about maybe going to the territorial capital for more education. Daniel was 9, still young but showing promise in everything he tried. Graham held Josie's hand as they watched their children laugh and talk, planning their futures. We did good, he said quietly, just for her to hear. We did better than good, she replied. We built something real, something lasting, not just this ranch or the school, but a family, a home. That night, as they lay in bed together, Graham pulled her close and said what he said every night before they fell asleep. I love you, Josie Brennan. I love you too, she whispered back and meant it with everything she was. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. Samuel married a rancher's daughter in 1904 and started his own horse ranch on land adjacent to theirs, making Graham a grandfather when his first grandson was born in 1905. Margaret went away to school in Phoenix, but came back to Agua Caliente in 1907, opening her own school in town, and eventually marrying the new doctor who moved to the area in 1908. Daniel showed an aptitude for business and started helping his father manage the ranch's finances, ensuring they were always profitable. Through it all, Graham and Josie remained the center of their growing family. They grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces gaining lines from years of sun and laughter. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared experiences and a lifetime of choosing each other every day. In 1912, on their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party. The whole town of Agua Caliente turned out, along with ranchers from miles around. Everyone wanted to celebrate the couple who had become something of a legend in the area. The schoolteacher and the cowboy who had found love in the middle of a blizzard. Graham stood up to make a speech, pulling Josie to her feet beside him. 30 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his 58 years. I was just a lonely ranch hand with nothing to my name but a horse and a rifle. Then I met this woman, and everything changed. She gave me a reason to build something, to be something more than I was. She gave me love and children and a home. She gave me a life I never dreamed I could have. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes still as intense as they had been that first day in the storm. Josie, you are still the best thing that ever happened to me. I would live through 1,000 blizzards if it meant finding you at the end of each one. Josie felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at her husband, her partner, her love. And I would be lost in 1,000 storms if I knew you would always come to find me, she said. You are my hero, Graham Brennan. You were then, and you are now. They kissed to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered, and in that moment, Josie thought about how much had changed since that terrifying day in February of 1882. She had been so scared then, so alone, surrounded by dangerous men in a deadly blizzard. She had thought she was going to die. Instead, she had lived. She had loved. She had built a family and a legacy that would last long after she was gone. And it had all started with a cowboy riding through a storm, hearing gunshots and deciding to help. Such a small decision in some ways, but it had changed everything. As the party continued around them, Graham pulled her close and whispered in her ear, "What are you thinking about?" "About fate," she said. "About how one moment can change your entire life. If that storm had not happened, if those bandits had not attacked me, if you had not been riding by at exactly that moment, we never would have met. All of this, everything we have built, would not exist." Graham considered this, then shook his head. "I do not believe that. I think we would have found each other somehow, storm or no storm. Some things are meant to be, Josie. You and me, we were always going to find each other. The blizzard just made it happen sooner." She smiled at his certainty, at his faith that they had been destined for each other. Maybe he was right. Maybe they would have met some other way in some other time. But she was glad it had happened the way it did, glad for every moment that had brought them to this point. They lived many more years together after that, watching their children thrive and their grandchildren grow. Graham's horses became famous throughout the territory and later, after 1912, throughout the new state of Arizona. Josie's schools educated hundreds of children, many of whom went on to become teachers themselves, spreading knowledge throughout the state. But more than any of their accomplishments, what mattered most was the love they shared. It was there in the way Graham still brought Josie coffee every morning, just like he had in that lined shack during the blizzard. It was there in the way Josie still watched for Graham to come home each evening, her heart lifting when she saw him riding up the road. It was there in their quiet conversations on the porch, in their shared laughter, in the way they still reached for each other in the night after decades of marriage. In 1925, Graham passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 71, with Josie holding his hand. She mourned him deeply, but she also celebrated the life they had shared, the 43 years of marriage that had been more than she ever could have hoped for. He had been her savior, her partner, her great love, and she knew she had been blessed beyond measure to have had him in her life. Josie lived another 5 years after Graham's death, staying in the house they had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. She taught until the very end, insisting that her mind was sharp even if her body was failing. And every evening, she would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, remembering the cowboy who had ridden through a blizzard to save her life and ended up giving her so much more. When Josie passed away in 1930 at the age of 70, she was buried next to Graham on a hill overlooking their ranch. Their children erected a simple headstone that read, "Graham and Josephine Brennan, together in life, together in death. A love forged in storm, tempered by time." The Brennan Ranch continued for generations after them, passed down through their children and grandchildren. The story of how Graham and Josie met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The schoolhouse Josie had started eventually became a proper building in Agua Caliente, with her name on a plaque by the door. Graham's horses founded bloodlines that were still prized decades later. But more than any physical legacy, what Graham and Josie left behind was proof that love could flourish even in the harshest conditions. That two people who started as strangers in a blizzard could build something beautiful together. That courage and kindness and devotion could create a life worth living, no matter how humble the beginnings. Their story became part of the fabric of Arizona territory, later the state of Arizona, a reminder of the men and women who had carved out lives in that harsh and beautiful land. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of a cowboy riding through a storm, And sometimes love begins in the most unlikely of circumstances. The blizzard that had nearly killed Josie had instead given her everything she had ever wanted. And the lonely cowboy who had saved her had found, in that act of courage, the family and love he had been seeking all his life. They had both been lost before they found each other, but together they had built something that would last long after they were gone. Their children and grandchildren never forgot the story. They told it to their own children, keeping alive the memory of the schoolteacher and the cowboy, the woman surrounded by danger, and the man who had not hesitated to ride to her rescue. It became a love story for the ages, proof that even in the wild and dangerous West, happy endings were possible for those brave enough to reach for them.